On August 31st, 1987, Time magazine printed an issue with a cover story cheekily titled "Those Asian American Whiz Kids," as to highlight the growing cultural phenomenon of academically and professionally exceptional Asian American immigrants. The demographic that was subject to decades of systemic and societal discrimination a little over a century ago is now the subject of praise by the same media that used to abuse them. In the past episodes, we examined the history of a variety of East and Southeast Asian demographics. Now we'll examine how exactly those Asian Americans transitioned from laborers or small shop owners to well-off students or white-collared professionals, from yellow peril to model minorities, so to speak. Since the early 1800s, Asian Americans have left an impact on the American landscape, but unfortunately the older generations of the community shrunk, following events such as a major exodus via legislation and internment camps. They stand in stark contrast to the new wave of Asian immigrants post-1965. By October 1965, the U.S. immigration policy was reformed when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed a more open policy that, while less restrictive, still held some strong preferences towards a certain type of immigrant. Those preferences include relatives of U.S. citizens or permanent residents, those with skills deemed useful to the United States, or refugees of violence or unrest. Though it abolished quotas per se, the system did place caps on each country and total immigration, as well as caps on each category. Not surprisingly, they sparked a wave of Asian refugees from Southeast Asia, such as those from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. After all, the United States did, well, inconvenience their landscape to a great extent. Also included in this modern wave of Asian immigrants are those possessing a highly technical background, such as those in engineering. What's so particularly interesting about this new wave of immigrants is the fact that it consisted of a considerable amount of people from mainland China. You see, until 1977, immigration from the actual Chinese mainland has been almost non-existent. The earlier Chinese immigrants mostly come from Hong Kong and the Canton region of southern China. They were working-class folks who spoke Cantonese, whereas this third wave of Chinese immigrants were college students and professionals who avoid the historical Chinatowns and instead flocked to the suburbs. The same narrative seems to follow other immigrants from various Asian countries. For example, in 1975, following the end of the Vietnam War, there was a large wave of Vietnamese immigrants who fled Vietnam in fear of communist reprisal. While working-class folks certainly existed amongst the crowd, a significant number of these Vietnamese immigrants were well-educated, financially comfortable, and proficient in English. According to the 1975 U.S. State Department data, more than 30% of the heads of first-wave households were medical professionals or technical managers, 16.9% worked in transportation, 11.7% had clerical or sales jobs in Vietnam, less than 5% were fishermen or farmers. The same story also follows the third wave of Korean immigrants. While the previous waves of Korean immigrants consisted of laborers, war victims, and political refugees who really had no choice but to escape their home country, this third wave consisted of white-collar professionals who voluntarily came to America for economic opportunity. Let's address this common narrative amongst third-wave Asian immigrants. The model minority myth takes on many narratives and false beliefs, such as the initial narrative published in the New York Times in 1966 about how Japanese Americans are even more successful than their white counterparts. It tells a story of a demographic that has found economic success despite their past hardships. It implies that any oppressed group can rise to wealth if they just kept their head down and worked hard. Not surprisingly, such narrative only grew in popularity as more third-wave immigrants emerged. Earlier in this series, I asked the question, how did the demographic went from poor laborers to one of the most economically successful demographics in the country? The answer, as it turns out, is they didn't. The inconvenient truth about Asian Americans is that we never went from poor railroad worker to rich Silicon Valley techie. The actual story goes more like this, and I'll tell this story from a Chinese perspective since I'm Chinese. The poor railroad worker watched all his friends get deported back to China while also witnessing his Japanese neighbor get mass incarcerated less than a century later. Sure, he's found some success running a mom-and-pop shop in Chinatown, but he's never quite left Chinatown. Meanwhile, thanks to the Immigration Act of 1965, a brand new wave of Asian immigrants moved to the United States to replace the older immigrant communities. They weren't poor like him, but middle-class professionals and students. Soon, he no longer becomes the face of Asian Americans. They do, and they want nothing to do with him. The thing is, he has kept his head down and worked hard to get to where he is. That's why he runs a mom and pop in Chinatown where he grew up. However, his success is nothing compared to the financial prosperity of the new immigrants who comfortably reside in the American suburbs due to the fact that they leveraged whatever class privilege they had in their home country and brought it over to the US. Then some people in the United States act like once upon a time the suburb residing Asians were just like him when he first arrived. See, part of what makes the model minority myth so harmful is that it not only erases a significant amount of history of Asian American immigrants, but it also ignores the present reality of the community. Asian Americans have one of the largest income gaps out of any demographic in the country, with the median income of Asians in LA ranging from over $400,000 to $23,000. Asian Americans have a vast and diverse history in the Americas for over 200 years while still managing to be seen as outsiders no matter how long we've been here. While the days of violent hate crimes and racist legislation may seem to be something in the distant past, it has become clear that white America's tolerance of us is painfully temporary. From anti-East Asian attacks caught on footage to a policy that nearly locked out international students, it is crucial to see the parallels between yesterday and today and to ensure that the tragedies of our past do not repeat themselves.